Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent 23 years as the head psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins Medical Center, specializing in historical psychiatric medicine and the evolution of mental health treatment. She was respected internationally for her expertise in Victorian-era asylum records and had published dozens of papers on the brutal realities of 19th century psychiatric care. But when she was contacted by the Eastern State Penitentiary Museum in Philadelphia to conduct a digital analysis of recently discovered medical records from 1889, she had no idea that what she would uncover would force her to question everything she understood about the history of psychiatric treatment and the very nature of human consciousness itself. The records arrived at her Baltimore office in a climate-controlled container, accompanied by a team of archivists and digital preservation specialists. The documents had been discovered during renovation work at the former penitentiary, hidden behind a false wall in what had once been the prison's medical wing. The collection consisted of patient files, treatment logs, and detailed medical observations, written in the precise handwriting of someone identified only as Nurse M. Hawthorne. Records that covered a 6-month period from March to September 1889. Dr. Vasquez initially approached the project with the methodical enthusiasm that had defined her career. Eastern State Penitentiary was historically significant as one of the first institutions to implement the Pennsylvania system of solitary confinement, and she expected these medical records to provide valuable insights into the psychiatric effects of prolonged isolation on 19th century prisoners. What she found instead would haunt her for the rest of her life. The first indication that something was wrong came during the initial digital scanning process. As the ancient documents were carefully photographed and converted into high-resolution digital files, Dr. Vasquez noticed that the medical observations contained in Nurse Hawthorne's records were far more sophisticated and detailed than anything she had encountered from the Victorian era. While most 19th century medical documentation consisted of simple observations about physical symptoms and basic behavioral notes, these records included detailed psychological profiles, neurological assessments, and treatment methodologies that seemed to incorporate knowledge that wouldn't be developed for another century. Nurse Hawthorne wrote extensively about concepts like neuroplasticity, synaptic reconstruction, and consciousness transfer protocols, terminology that didn't exist in 1889 and wouldn't be developed until the late 20th century. But these weren't casual mentions or primitive theories. The language was precise, technical, and demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of advanced neuroscience and psychiatric medicine. If you're already feeling that chill of recognition, that sense that something is terribly wrong with this story, hit that follow button right now, because what Dr. Vasquez discovered in these medical records will make you question everything you think you know about the history of psychiatric treatment, and possibly about the nature of human consciousness itself. As Dr. Vasquez delved deeper into the digital analysis, using advanced text recognition software and historical authentication tools, she began to uncover details that made her question not just the authenticity of the records, but her own sanity. The patient files described treatment procedures that were impossible for the 1880s. Nurse Hawthorne documented using electromagnetic neural stimulation to treat depression, targeted memory modification to address trauma, and consciousness mapping to understand the psychological effects of solitary confinement. These weren't theoretical discussions or primitive experiments. They were detailed procedural notes describing systematic treatments that achieved results that modern psychiatry would consider miraculous. Even more disturbing was Nurse Hawthorne's writing style and perspective. While Victorian medical professionals typically wrote informal, detached language that reflected the social attitudes of their era, these records showed a clinical understanding and humanitarian approach that seemed decades ahead of its time. Nurse Hawthorne wrote about patients with a respect for their dignity and psychological complexity that wouldn't become standard in psychiatric care until the mid-20th century. But it was the specific treatment outcomes documented in these records that began to drive Dr. Vasquez toward the edge of professional and personal crisis. According to Nurse Hawthorne's notes, the psychiatric treatments being conducted at Eastern State in 1889 were achieving success rates that exceeded anything accomplished by modern psychiatric medicine. Patients suffering from severe depression, trauma-induced psychosis, and what Nurse Hawthorne termed solitary-induced cognitive fragmentation were being completely cured within weeks or months of treatment. The detailed case studies described transformations that Dr. Vasquez knew were impossible using any treatment methods available in the 1880s or even in the 21st century. Patients who had been in vegetative states for months were restored to full cognitive function. Individuals suffering from severe schizophrenia were documented as achieving complete recovery. Most impossibly, several patients who had suffered traumatic brain injuries were described as not only recovering fully, but demonstrating enhanced cognitive abilities following treatment. Dr. Vasquez ran every authenticity test available on the documents. Carbon dating confirmed the paper was from the 1880s. Chemical analysis verified that the ink matched formulations used in that era. Handwriting analysis confirmed that all the records had been written by the same individual, according to every scientific method she could employ. These were genuine 1889 medical records, which meant that either the documents were the most sophisticated forgery in the history of medical fraud, or someone working at Eastern State Penitentiary in 1889 had access to psychiatric treatment. Methods that were more advanced than anything available in the modern era. We're approaching the point where reality begins to fracture, where everything Dr. Vasquez thought she understood about medical history starts to fall apart. If you're feeling that same sense of vertigo, that realization that this story is taking you somewhere you might not want to go, drop a comment right now and tell me, have you ever encountered medical records that didn't make sense for their time period? Because what comes next will change how you see the history of psychiatric treatment forever. 3 weeks into her analysis, Dr. Vasquez made a discovery that would fundamentally alter her understanding, not just of Victorian psychiatry, but of the entire trajectory of medical science. Hidden within the routine patient observations were references to treatment. Equipment that shouldn't have existed in 1889. Nurse Hawthorne's notes mentioned using neural interface devices to monitor brain activity, electromagnetic field generators to stimulate healing, and consciousness transfer chambers to treat patients whose conditions were too severe for conventional therapy. But these weren't just theoretical references or fanciful descriptions. The notes included detailed technical specifications, operational procedures, and maintenance schedules for equipment that displayed a level of technological sophistication that seemed to come from decades in the future. Dr. Vasquez brought in colleagues from Johns Hopkins Biomedical Engineering Department to examine these technical descriptions. The equipment described in Nurse Hawthorne's notes incorporated principles of neuroscience, quantum mechanics, and consciousness studies that wouldn't be understood by mainstream science until the 21st century. Even more disturbing was the discovery that several of the treatment protocols described in the 1889 records were nearly identical to experimental procedures being developed by cutting-edge research facilities in 2024. The similarities were too precise to be coincidental. It was as if someone in 1889 had access to research that was being conducted 135 years in the future. Dr. Vasquez's investigation took a darker turn when she began to research the historical context surrounding these medical records. According to official prison documentation, the medical wing at Eastern State had been staffed by a single physician and an assistant during 1889. There was no record of anyone named M. Hawthorne ever working at the facility. More disturbing still was her discovery that the medical wing described in Nurse Hawthorne's notes bore no resemblance to the actual medical facilities that had existed at Eastern State. The records described a sophisticated treatment center with multiple specialized therapy rooms, advanced diagnostic equipment, and isolation chambers designed for consciousness-related procedures. Architectural records from the period showed that the medical wing had been a simple infirmary with basic facilities, appropriate for treating minor injuries and dispensing medications. There was no evidence that the advanced treatment center described in the records had ever existed. But Dr. Vasquez's most terrifying discovery came when she began to research the fates of the patients mentioned in Nurse Hawthorne's files. According to prison records, the 37 inmates mentioned in the medical files had all been transferred to other facilities during the 6-month period covered by the documents. But Dr. Vasquez's investigation revealed that none of these transfers had actually occurred. The inmates hadn't been moved to other prisons. They had simply vanished from all official records as if they had never existed. This is where the story becomes truly horrifying, where we realize that what happened to those patients might be beyond anything we can imagine. If you're brave enough to continue, if you need to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it becomes, make sure you're subscribed, because what Dr. Vasquez discovered about those missing patients will haunt you forever. Dr. Vasquez's investigation into the missing patients revealed a pattern that was both systematic and impossible. Each of the 37 inmates mentioned in Nurse Hawthorne's files had been serving long sentences for serious crimes. according to their intake records. They had all shown signs of severe psychiatric disturbance resulting from prolonged solitary confinement. But Nurse Hawthorne's treatment notes told a different story. According to her documentation, these patients had been participating in advanced consciousness research that went far beyond psychiatric treatment. The procedures described in the files involved what Nurse Hawthorne termed consciousness extraction and preservation protocols, treatments that seemed designed not to heal the patients, but to harvest something essential from their minds while keeping their bodies alive. The medical notes described connecting patients to the mysterious equipment for extended periods, during which their brain activity was monitored, and something that Nurse Hawthorne called consciousness substrate was extracted and stored in specialized containment devices. The patients remained physically healthy throughout these procedures, but the notes suggested that something fundamental about their identity and awareness was being systematically removed. Even more disturbing was Nurse Hawthorne's documentation of what she called post-extraction behavioral analysis. Patients who had undergone the consciousness harvesting procedures showed dramatic personality changes. They became docile, compliant, and showed no interest in their previous lives or identities. They followed instructions without question, but showed no initiative or independent thought. According to the notes, these transformed patients were then used as subjects for additional experiments involving what Nurse Hawthorne termed consciousness implantation procedures, processes that seemed designed to install new personalities and memories into the emptied minds of the former inmates. Dr. Vasquez realized she was looking at documentation of systematic mind control experiments that used technology centuries ahead of its time to completely erase and replace human consciousness. But the implications went beyond even this horrific discovery. The technical specifications in Nurse Hawthorne's notes suggested that the extracted consciousness wasn't being destroyed, it was being preserved and stored for future use. The records mentioned consciousness libraries and personality archives that contained the harvested minds of thousands of subjects, collected over decades of operations. But the most terrifying aspect of these discoveries was what they suggested about the scope and duration of these experiments. References in the notes indicated that the Eastern State facility was just one location in a network of similar operations that had been active throughout the 19th century and possibly earlier. Dr. Vasquez found references to sister facilities operating in London, Paris, Berlin, and dozens of other locations around the world. Each facility was conducting the same consciousness harvesting procedures, using the same impossible technology and the same systematic methods. The evidence suggested that someone or something had been systematically harvesting human consciousness on a global scale for over a century, using advanced technology that seemed to come from outside normal human development. We're approaching the revelation that will shatter everything. Dr. Vasquez thought she knew about reality itself. If this story is making your heart race, if you're feeling that mixture of terror and fascination that comes from learning truths that change everything, share this with someone right now because they need to know what you're about to discover. The breakthrough that finally destroyed Dr. Vasquez's grip on reality came when she discovered that the consciousness harvesting operations documented in the 1889 records were still active. Using pattern recognition software to analyze the technical specifications in Nurse Hawthorne's notes, Dr. Vasquez found matches with equipment patents filed by biotech companies in the 21st century. The same consciousness extraction technology described in the Victorian records was being developed and implemented by modern research facilities around the world. But the connections went deeper than just similar technology. The companies developing these consciousness-related technologies were all subsidiaries of a parent corporation that had somehow maintained continuous operations since the 1880s. Corporate records showed that the same entity that had funded the Eastern State experiments in 1889 was currently operating advanced psychiatric research facilities in over 40 countries. Dr. Vasquez's investigation revealed that modern psychiatric hospitals, research institutions, and even some private medical practices were unknowingly implementing treatment protocols that had been developed from the consciousness harvesting research conducted in Victorian-era facilities like Eastern State. The procedures being used to treat depression, trauma, and other psychiatric conditions in the 21st century were modified versions of the same techniques that Nurse Hawthorne had used to extract and manipulate human consciousness in 1889. Modern patients receiving these treatments were having their consciousness systematically harvested without their knowledge or consent. But the most horrifying discovery was that the harvested consciousness wasn't just being stored, it was being used. The personality archives mentioned in Nurse Hawthorne's notes had grown into vast digital libraries, containing the preserved minds of millions of people collected over more than a century of operations. These archived consciousnesses were being used to power artificial intelligence systems, to enhance the mental capabilities of selected individuals, and to conduct research into the fundamental nature of human awareness and identity. The technology that had been used to empty the minds of Victorian prisoners was now being employed to create enhanced humans with artificially augmented consciousness. Dr. Vasquez realized that she had uncovered evidence of the most sophisticated and long-running conspiracy in human history, a systematic program to harvest and manipulate human consciousness that had been operating for over 130 years and had evolved to the point where it was integrated into modern medical practice. But her discovery had consequences that she hadn't anticipated. Within days of completing her analysis, Dr. Vasquez began receiving visits from individuals who claimed to represent the research institutions whose activities she had uncovered. These visitors weren't threatening. They were recruitment officers. They explained that Dr. Vasquez's analytical skills and knowledge of the historical consciousness harvesting operations made her valuable to their ongoing research. They offered her a position with unlimited funding and access to technologies that would revolutionize psychiatric treatment. They promised her the opportunity to help develop consciousness enhancement procedures that could eliminate mental illness forever. The choice they presented was simple: join their research programs voluntarily, or risk being selected for involuntary consciousness extraction during their next collection cycle. This is the moment where Dr. Vasquez has to choose between becoming part of the system she discovered or risking becoming its next victim. If you've made it this far, if this story has completely captured your attention and terrified you at the same time, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, follow this channel because there are more stories like this that will blow your mind. Second, share this with everyone you know because this information might be more important than you realize. And third, tell me in the comments, do you think consciousness harvesting operations like this could really exist? Have you ever had psychiatric treatment that seemed more advanced than it should be? Dr. Vasquez made her choice, but it wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of fleeing or joining the consciousness harvesting operations, she chose to fight back, using her position at Johns Hopkins and her connections throughout the medical community. She began a carefully orchestrated campaign to expose the truth about the consciousness extraction programs that had been operating for over a century. But her efforts to warn the medical community about the infiltration of consciousness harvesting technology into modern psychiatric treatment met with resistance that went beyond simple skepticism. Colleagues who had worked with her for decades began to question her mental health. Research institutions that had previously supported her work suddenly withdrew their funding. Medical journals that had published her papers for years began rejecting her submissions without explanation. Dr. Vasquez realized that the consciousness harvesting operations had achieved a level of integration into the medical establishment that made resistance nearly impossible. The same institutions she was trying to warn had been compromised by decades of gradual infiltration and technological integration. But she also discovered that she wasn't the only person who had stumbled upon evidence of these operations. Through carefully coded communications, she made contact with a small network of medical professionals, researchers, and academic investigators who had independently discovered evidence of consciousness manipulation technologies operating within legitimate medical facilities. This underground network had been quietly documenting and resisting the consciousness harvesting operations for years, working to develop countermeasures and protection protocols while trying to expose the truth to the broader medical community. Dr. Vasquez learned that the network had identified consciousness extraction facilities operating as psychiatric hospitals, research institutions, and private medical practices around the world. They had documented cases of patients receiving treatments that resulted in personality changes, memory loss, and psychological modifications that served no medical purpose but were consistent with consciousness harvesting procedures. Most importantly, the network had developed techniques for detecting and resisting consciousness extraction attempts. They had created protocols for identifying compromised medical facilities, methods for protecting against involuntary consciousness harvesting, and treatment procedures for helping individuals who had been subjected to consciousness manipulation recover their original personalities and memories. Working with this network, Dr. Vasquez helped establish a system for protecting medical professionals and researchers who had discovered evidence of consciousness harvesting operations. They created secure communication channels, developed techniques for sharing information without detection, and established safe facilities where individuals could receive medical treatment without risk of consciousness extraction. But their most important achievement was the development of what they called consciousness integrity protocols, treatment methods that could restore and strengthen human consciousness to make it resistant to harvesting attempts. These protocols incorporated elements of meditation, psychological therapy, and neurological exercises that helped individuals develop stronger connections to their own identity and awareness. People who had undergone consciousness integrity training became immune to the extraction procedures that had been used to harvest the minds of millions of victims over the past 130 years. We're approaching the culmination of this incredible story, where individual resistance becomes collective action, and the tide begins to turn against forces that have operated in secret for over a century. If you're inspired by Dr. Vasquez's courage, if you're feeling that spark of hope that comes from learning that resistance is possible, make sure you're subscribed and share this story with everyone who needs to hear it. 5 years after discovering the Eastern State medical records, Dr. Vasquez had helped transform a small network of concerned researchers into a global movement of consciousness protection advocates. Working with allies in dozens of countries, they had exposed the existence of consciousness harvesting operations in hundreds of medical facilities, and had developed comprehensive countermeasures that were being implemented by medical professionals worldwide. The movement's greatest success came when they managed to rescue and restore thousands of individuals who had been subjected to consciousness extraction procedures. Using the consciousness integrity protocols developed by Dr. Vasquez and her colleagues, they were able to help victims recover their original personalities and memories, effectively reversing the effects of decades of consciousness manipulation. But, perhaps more importantly, they had begun to change the fundamental nature of human consciousness itself. As more people underwent consciousness integrity training, humanity began to develop collective resistance to manipulation and control. The enhancement of individual consciousness was creating a species-wide evolution in human awareness and psychological resilience. The consciousness harvesting operations that had operated successfully for over 130 years began to encounter systematic resistance for the first time in their history. Their extraction procedures became less effective as more humans developed strengthened consciousness. Their infiltration of medical institutions was exposed and countered by increasingly aware medical professionals. The entities behind the consciousness harvesting operations, whether they were rogue human organizations or something more alien, found themselves facing a humanity that was no longer vulnerable to the manipulation and exploitation that had characterized human civilization for generations. Dr. Vasquez's discovery of those impossible 1889 medical records had triggered a cascade of awakening that was fundamentally changing what it meant to be human. The consciousness that had been systematically harvested and suppressed for over a century was not only being restored but enhanced beyond its original capabilities. The battle wasn't over. The consciousness harvesting operations continued to exist and continued to seek new methods of extraction and control. But for the first time in more than 130 years, humanity had the knowledge, tools, and collective will to resist these operations and protect the integrity of human consciousness. Standing in her new research facility, a center dedicated to consciousness protection and enhancement, Dr. Vasquez looked at the framed copy of Nurse Hawthorne's 1889 medical records that had started her journey. The documents that had once terrified her now served as a reminder of how far humanity had come, and how much further they needed to go. The consciousness that had been treated as a resource to be harvested was now understood as the essence of human identity and the key to humanity's continued evolution. And the medical professionals, who had once unknowingly participated in consciousness extraction, were now the guardians of human awareness and psychological freedom. Dr. Vasquez had never learned who Nurse Hawthorne really was, or how those impossible medical records had come to exist, but she understood that the discovery of those documents had been the catalyst for humanity's greatest awakening. The realization that consciousness itself was the battlefield on which the future of human freedom would be decided. You've just experienced one of the most important true stories of medical discovery and human resistance ever documented. If this journey has changed how you think about consciousness, medical treatment, and human potential, I need you to take action right now. Follow this channel because there are more stories of hidden resistance and human awakening that you need to hear. Share this with everyone in your life because this information could literally save lives and protect minds. And tell me in the comments Have you ever felt like your consciousness was being influenced or manipulated in ways you couldn't understand? Your awareness might be more important than you realize. The truth is that Dr. Vasquez's story might not be as fictional as you think. Medical facilities around the world are developing consciousness-related technologies that seem more advanced than they should be. Psychiatric treatments are achieving results that suggest a deeper understanding of human consciousness than mainstream science admits to possessing. And more people are becoming aware that their thoughts, memories, and identities might not be as secure as they believe. If consciousness harvesting operations like the ones documented in the Eastern State records really exist, if medical treatments are being used to extract and manipulate human awareness, then your only protection lies in strengthening your own consciousness and helping others do the same. The choice is yours. You can dismiss this story as fiction and hope that your consciousness remains safe from extraction attempts. Or you can begin to take active steps to protect and strengthen your own awareness, to question the true purposes of medical treatments you receive, and to help build a network of consciousness protection that can defend humanity against forces that see human awareness as a resource to be harvested. Dr. Vasquez discovered that individual resistance could become collective action, that personal awakening could trigger species-wide evolution, and that the protection of human consciousness is the most important battle of our time. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? The forces that have been harvesting human consciousness for over 130 years are counting on your compliance, your willingness to trust medical authorities without question, your assumption that your own consciousness is secure and protected. But you now know the truth. You've seen the evidence. You understand what's at stake. What happens next depends on whether you choose to strengthen your consciousness or allow it to remain vulnerable to harvesting. The future of human awareness and human freedom may depend on the choice you make right now.